In this lesson, we'll create the animation, controls, and macro for our 2D spaceship. In the link in the description, you'll find the link to freely download the assets and scripts or macro we created in this video. Feel free to download them and follow along, dissect the macro, or to simply use the completed effect in your game or project. Let's begin by bringing in one of our spaceship sprites into our scene. Something to note, if we look in our sprite sheet, each of our ships has two variations, a base and an upgrade form. While you can mix and match any of the sprites, we want to start with our base form. With our sprite now in our scene, let's first scale our ship to match our parallax space background. Let's next add the animated fire sprite to the back of our ship. If we look in our sprite sheet effects sprite sheet, we can find our animated fire sprite and explosion sprites. Since this is already an animated sprite sequence, we don't have to create an animation for our sprites. Instead, if we drag the sequence into our scene, Unity will automatically create the animation for us. To do this, we need to expand our sprites, then shift select the fire sprites 1 through 5. With our sequence selected, we can then drag it into the hierarchy of our scene. We will then be prompted to name and save our animation, and we'll name it Astor Galaxy Exhaust Fire Animation and save it in our animation folder. If we now bring up our animation window and hit play, we can see the animation as it cycles through our sprites. Let's next make our fire sprite a child of our spaceship sprite and rotate and move it to where it appears to be coming from our spaceship's exhaust. We'll also change its layer order to 21, which is one layer higher than our spaceship sprite. With that complete, let's begin creating the controls in the macro for our spaceship. We'll start by selecting our ship and adding a character controller component. Let's next add a flow machine component to our ship and create and save a macro, which we're going to call Astor Galaxy Spaceship Macro. Before we begin, let's go over the logic that we're going to create for the movement controllers of our spaceship. For our movement, we'll be using a lot of the integrated movement controls of our character controller. Instead of a key or mouse input, we can use our input axis to control which direction our ship will be going. So let's begin by first creating 4 variables. We'll create one scene graph variable and 3 object graph variables. We'll call our scene variable spaceship object, and our 3 object graph variables will be floats, which we'll call the first one movement X, the next one movement Y, and the last one speed reduction. Let's begin by using our start event to set our spaceship scene object variable. Since our macro is on our game object, we'll simply use self as the input for our spaceship scene variable. For our movement, instead of using a mouse down or a button press event, we'll be using our input axis. So let's create a set variable node for our movement X. For its value, we'll be using an input get axis node. And for our X variable, we'll be using our horizontal axis. And we also want to place this on an update event to be sure that it's always getting our player input. Let's next create a character controller move node, and we'll place that on an update as well. For our character controller input, we'll use our spaceship scene variable. And for our motion, let's create a vector3 create XY node, and we'll use our movement X variable for its X input. Before we continue, let's first test out our graph. We can see by using our horizontal input, either our A and D key, our arrow keys, or moving left and right on a gamepad, we can now move our ship in a horizontal direction. Additionally, if we look within our graph, we can see the values which are being input into our character controller. Before we move on to creating our vertical input, we need to first stop our ship from being able to move outside of our play area. To do this, we'll use our Astro Galaxy Collider, which is in our prefab folder. and we'll make it a child of our game object. We'll also need to ensure that it's long enough to encompass our ship's character controller. While placing our collider, we can also enable our mesh renderer to help us better place where the collider will be in our scene. Since we're using a character controller, our ship will automatically react with collision objects, so using our custom collider should prevent it from moving outside of our game area. If we now hit play, our ship should no longer be able to move outside the borders of our play area. With that complete, let's use our vertical input axis to set our movement Y variable, and also place the variable within the Y input of our Vector 3 create node. Additionally, in order to fix the inverted controls of our horizontal input, we can simply use a multiply node and multiply the output of our horizontal get axis node by -1 before setting our movement X variable. With that complete, let's test out our functionality. We can now see that our ship can move both vertically and horizontally. However, currently the speed of our ship makes it fairly hard to control. So in order to alleviate this, let's reduce the speed by dividing the value of both our input axis with our speed reduction variable. And we'll set our speed reduction value to 8. And let's go to play mode to test out our graph. With our spaceship movement complete, let's add our spaceship laser firing functionality.
Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell to be the first to see this and many other tutorials, game development tips, and free game asset giveaways.